Good afternoon, guys. Mr. Monk here. I just wanted to come to you today, film kind of a semi-short video talking about some of the reading I assigned you from the section Politics of War all the way to the end of the chapter. I'm going to try to do this over the next few weeks. So each little section I give you to read, try to give you some verbal notes, kind of go over it, talk kind of like we just did in class, have some discussion, let you guys watch this video and let it supplement what you're getting through your discussion post and through, all the little assignments that I'm going to give you. So we'll get started so we won't take all day. But like I said, I assigned you the Politics of War section through the end of the chapter. So it's about 4 or 5 different little sections we're going to talk about today. We're going to continue on through our discussion of the Civil War. Of course, we're getting near the end of the war. We're coming up on the presidential election of 1864. As we know, the war is going to end in 1865. So we're getting near the end. So what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about the election, and then we're going to talk about Grant really wrapping up the war for Lincoln, and then kind of the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater. So let's get started. All right, so beginning politics of war, right? So in the United States, when we look at the history of presidential elections, all right, elections don't wait around, okay, for a good time. Meaning, if you're in the middle of economic crisis, if you're in the middle of a global pandemic, of a war or anything, okay, when the presidential election is supposed to occur is going to occur. All right, and of course, as fate would have it, the presidential election of 1864 is going to fall right in the midst of a civil war. Right, so political infighting in the North is going to add greatly to Lincoln's woe in the election. So factions within his own party are going to give him some trouble. There are going to be many Republicans, right, that distrust his ability or doubt his commitment to abolition, right, the freeing of all the slaves. And they're going to seek to tie his hands by kind of trying to involve him in some political controversies. And they're really going to try to remove him for office by having someone run against him and beat him in the election of 1864. Conspicuous among his critics were a group led by the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, a man by the name of Salmon Chase. And of course, burdensome to Lincoln, it's also going to be the creation of this Congressional Committee on the Conduct of War, formed late in 1861. And what this is going to be kind of a committee made up of radical Republicans that are really going to oppose Lincoln and think he's not going far enough, right, for the abolition of slavery. And what that committee is essentially going to do is it's going to conduct research, but it's going to come out and essentially keep making claims that Lincoln, right, is not doing exactly right what he needs to do to win the war. They're going to criticize the expansion of the presidential power in wartime, and of course they're going to press him very zealously over emancipation. But most dangerous of all to the Union at the time period, and especially during the election, you could argue would be the Northern Democrats, right? So the Northern Democrats were going to be the Democrats that were left over following all the Southern Democrats that left and seceded from the Union, right? So a lot of the talent that made up the Democratic Party left and went with the Confederacy. But of course there were Democrats in the North, right, that are going to be still involved in Union politics. Right, they're going to be tainted, though, with this association with the seceders, right, because it was the Democratic Party that kind of seceded from the Union. And, of course, tragedy is going to befall the Democrats a little bit into the war when Stephen A. Douglas, right, if you remember, who beat Lincoln, right, in the senatorial race, kind of was his arch rival, is going to die. And then, of course, lacking really a leader in 1864, the Democrats are going to be greatly divided, as we've seen in the past. So a large group of war Democrats who are going to actually support the war and Lincoln's administration. But they're also going to have tens of thousands of peace Democrats, as we call them, that did not support, right, the war. And at the extreme, I guess, right, you could say, were the so-called Copperheads, right? And I asked you kind of a question in your discussion last week, what were the Copperheads, or in an assignment, right? So Copperheads, right, openly obstructed the war through attacks against the draft, against Lincoln, and especially after 1863 against emancipation, right? So they denounced the president as the Illinois ape, and right, condemned the war that was being fought on behalf of blacks in America, right? So notorious among the Copperheads was a sometime congressman from Ohio, Clement L. Vallandigham. All right. So this character, he is going to publicly demand an end to this wicked and cruel war. And essentially what's going to be the fate of this man for coming out and speaking greatly against Lincoln and causing up some trouble is he's going to be convicted by a military tribunal in 1863 and of treason, and he's going to be sentenced to prison. All right, but Lincoln's going to have another idea for him. He's going to decide that if Vallandigham liked the Confederates so much, he ought to be banished to their lines. Okay, so this is exactly what Lincoln's going to have done, and Vallandigham's going to be banished to the Confederate lines. Okay, but he's not going to be silenced so quickly. He's eventually going to make his way back to Canada, actually, where he's going to run for the governorship of Ohio in Canada. All right, you might say, how do you do that? All right, but he did, and he actually is going to poll a very significant vote. Okay, he's going to return to his own state before the war ended, right, by breaking the law. And although he's going to defy, right, Lincoln, he's never going to be prosecuted for returning to Ohio. All right, so that's what it shows is, right, some of this struggle Lincoln's really dealing with as far as the aggression and the willingness of people to oppose his administration. But what we're going to see is Lincoln's going to emerge victorious in the election of 1864. So let's talk about that now. All right, so as the election's going to approach, Lincoln's precarious authority is going to depend on retaining Republican support, right, while spiking the threat from the Peace Democrats and the Copperheads, right? So Lincoln had to do two things to win this election. He had to keep the support of the Republicans, or as many Republicans as possible, and he had to strike against any threats that were coming from the Democratic side, right? Threats to make him look inept or not able to be president any longer because of failure, right, to end the war or whatever it may be. So he had to do those two things. All right, so fearing defeat, actually, the official Republican Party is going to execute, though, a very clever maneuver for the election. And this is politics at its best. Okay, so joining with the war Democrats, okay, right, that did support the war and support Lincoln's handling of the war. Those two groups are going to join together, in a sense, for a short while and call their party the Union Party, okay? And this was an attempt to garnish the support, to actually join the support of greater numbers of people to ensure that the Republican base, right, won the election. So thus, the Republican Party is going to pass out of existence for a short amount of time. All right, so Lincoln's renomination at first is going to encounter surprisingly strong opposition, right? But in the end, without any really serious dissent, Lincoln is going to be nominated by the Union Party. So his running mate, or his vice president candidate, is going to be Andrew Johnson, right, as we know, who will become president when Lincoln is assassinated. He was actually a loyal war Democrat from Tennessee who began the war actually as a small slave owner. He was placed on the Union Party ticket to sew up the election by attracting war Democrats and the voters in the border states, right? And this is how politics really works. You see the same thing that occurs with JFK in the 1960s with Vice President and then later President Johnson, right? So the candidate who's running for president, there are going to be certain areas that they need to win or people that they need to attract. So oftentimes what will happen is that whoever is the vice presidential candidate, they are put on the ticket simply to help attract those groups or those people that really need to vote for the candidate for them to win, right? So this is what Johnson's going to be for Lincoln, right? He's going to be a Democrat. So the Republicans, by nominating Lincoln and then putting Johnson on the ticket, are what they're hoping is to make sure, right, those war Democrats do indeed vote for Lincoln, okay, to solidify Lincoln's renomination and then election as president, or re-election as president. Right, and of course Southerners and Copperheads alike are going to condemn both candidates, right, as two ignorant, third-rate, backwoods politicians born in log cabins, right? So Democrats, right, kind of embattled and split up amongst themselves, are going to nominate and dispose, actually, the old war hero that Lincoln had disposed of, General McClellan. All right, and I know sometime before spring break we talked about how General McClellan would come back into the discussion in the election of 1864. So Democrats, right, those that kind of remained over after the war Democrats are going to depart for the Union Party, are going to help to nominate General McClellan to run against Lincoln. So the campaign is going to be very noisy and very heated between the two men, right? We talked about their relationship, right, and how McClellan was kind of arrogant, right, and how Lincoln kind of put up with McClellan for a while, but their relationship was very, very poor, right? So Democrats, right, are going to cry things like Old Abe remove McClellan, but now McClellan's going to remove Old Abe. They also sang and chanted things like Mac will win the Union back, right? So, and the Union Party is going to shout, right, Uncle Abe and Andy, and urge vote as you shoot. And of course, their most effective slogan is going to be, right, a saying of Lincoln's, don't swap horses in the middle of the river. So essentially, right, don't swap presidents in the middle of a civil war. So Lincoln's re-election is going to be gravely in doubt. At the beginning, right, the war was going badly, right? We talked about that prior to spring break, right? The Union had suffered great defeats, right? It did not make Lincoln's administration look good, did not make the reputation of the Union Army look good. The atmosphere of gloom is going to change electrically really right before the election. Really right before ballots start being cast. And what's going to happen is that the North, or the Union, is going to enjoy a series of successive victories that is going to really improve the morale and the mood of a lot of Northern voters for the election. So Admiral Farragut is going to capture Mobile, Alabama, a city pretty close to us, right? General Sherman is going to seize Atlanta. General Sheridan is going to lay waste to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And the president's going to pull through, okay? Kind of with some of these close Union victories, and then with some sketchy, you could say, forms of voting. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So actually, a lot of Northern soldiers were actually furloughed home, right, to see their families, but what it also did is allowed them to go vote for Lincoln. One Pennsylvania veteran is going to claim that he voted 49 times, okay, once for himself, and then 48 other times for all the 48 members of his company that couldn't be there. Other soldiers are going to be permitted to cast their ballots at the front. So what you're going to have is kind of, under the circumstances, the rules are going to be stretched to allow soldiers to vote. Lincoln, bolstered by the so-called bayonet vote, is going to vanquish General McClellan. Electoral count of 212 to 21, with the loss of only Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey. But McClellan is going to run a much closer popular vote than he does the electoral count. So he actually amassed 45% of the popular vote. Okay, so you just really see how our constitutional system is working out there with the Electoral College, how it looks like a blowout, but in terms of popular vote, it really wasn't. Right, but Lincoln's going to win where he needs to win. So one of the consequences of Lincoln winning right in the election of 1864 is the fact that it's going to be really crushing defeat, right, for the South, and especially for the Northern Democrats, because the removal of Lincoln was really the last great hope of the Confederacy for a Confederate victory, right? Because if someone was elected president, perhaps even a Democrat, maybe they would be willing to negotiate for peace with the South, right? But Lincoln was in this war. He had already expressed, right, that this war would be fought to the end, right? The old South would not come back into the Union as it left. So this was really a great last hope for the Confederacy. But of course, Lincoln wins, and what you see right after Lincoln wins is you see a sharp increase in the number of Southern deserters following the election. So that kind of proves that theory, right, that Southerners were kind of banking on this chance that Lincoln might be beat in the election. So let's move on to the section Grant outlasts Lee. So this is kind of where we're coming to the end of the war here. So after Gettysburg, right, Grant is going to be brought in from the west over Meade. We talked about the resourcefulness and the usefulness of General Grant, right, and his ability just kind of to bare knuckle win battles. And this is going to kind of be the type of general that Lincoln has been looking for all along. Right, Lincoln needed a general who, employing the superior resources of the North, and the North did in fact have superior resources, right? The industrial strength to produce great amounts of war material really was a great benefactor in the war for the North. But Lincoln needed somebody who could use those great strengths and who would have, right, the intestinal stamina to drive straight ahead regardless of casualties, right? And we talked about this. Generals like General McClellan, right? They had the strength, they had the training, but they were kind of scared to move. They didn't want to lose their men. All right, Grant's not going to have that problem. And his way of fighting was just kind of like a bulldog tenacity style, if you really think at it. So Grant was a man, right, for type of a meat grinder type of warfare. So his overall basic strategy was to assail the enemy's armies simultaneously so that the armies couldn't help each other, right, and hence could be destroyed piecemeal. So Grant's strategy was, we have to find the enemy, we have to hit him as hard as we can, break him up, break him down, and pulverize him until he can't fight anymore. So his personal motto for his life was, when in doubt, fight. So a grimly determined Grant with more than 100,000 men is going to strike for Richmond. He's going to engage Lee in a series of furious battles in the wilderness of Virginia during May and June of 1864. During this time, Grant's going to suffer 50,000 casualties, so half his force. But Lee is going to lose great numbers in proportion as well. So in a gasset gamble on June 3rd, 1864, Grant's going to order a frontal assault on Cold Harbor, right? So Cold Harbor, the Confederates were set up pretty much just waiting for the Union soldiers to come. The Union soldiers are going to advance in almost certain death with papers actually pinned on their backs that had their names and their addresses on the paper. All right, that's how serious this situation was, and they knew what kind of thing they were walking or running into. In about just a few minutes, really 5 to 10, 15 minutes, 7,000 men were killed or wounded. Okay, so this really gives you an idea of the type of warfare Grant is willing to wage, right? So public opinion in the North, right, is going to be appalled by this blood and guts warfare and type of fighting, right? Critics are going to cry that Grant the Butcher had gone insane, but his basic strategy of hammering ahead seemed brutally necessary, right? So he could trade 2 men for 1 and still beat the enemy to its knees, right? Yes, he was losing great numbers of men at alarming rates, but what he was doing is that he was winning, okay? And Lincoln needed a general that would win. All right, so early in 1865, the Confederates, tasting the bitter dregs of defeat, are going to try desperately to negotiate peace with Lincoln. Of course, right, Lincoln understands and knows what this is. It's a last chance, last ditch effort for the Confederacy to try to come out of this and negotiate for peace. Right, but Lincoln's going to say, no way, right? he understands that the Union is fairly close to victory, so he's going to let the war play out. So the war is going to grind on for just a few more months. So of course the end is going to come very dramatically sudden. Rapidly advancing Northern troops are going to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital, after they shell it for days. And Grant's going to corner General Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia in April of 1865. Right, so for the surrender ceremony, Grant's going to show up and actually in a private's uniform where he had just had his stars for his general stars sewed on the side. He's going to be muddy. He's going to be unshaven. He's just going to look right, not like he put much into his appearance. And Lee's going to show up right in his best dress with his sword and with everything clean, his boots polished, everything. It really shows you kind of how different these two men were. But the one, right, who looked like he didn't have it together was the one actually accepting the terms of surrender. There at Appomattox, on Palm Sunday, actually, Lee is going to surrender to Grant, and of course, Grant's going to give generous terms of surrender to the South until Lee. Among other concessions, the hungry Confederates were allowed to keep their own horses to take on for spring plowing. Okay, so of course, following their meeting, right, there's going to be a lot of Union soldiers who are going to be cheering, right, but Grant is going to silence them quickly, right, and he's going to say the war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again. And this is going to begin really this thought process of the war is over, right, and now that it's over, there are going to be different ideas about how the South should be treated. All right, whether they should be treated as traitors and treated that way, and make it really hard for them to find their place back in the Union. And there's going to be other thoughts, right? Kind of like Grant. Hey, the war's over. You know, they're our countrymen again. Let's accept them back into the fold, and let's restore our nation and its unity as quickly as possible. So Lincoln himself is actually going to travel to Richmond. Just 40 hours after Jefferson Davis leaves the Capitol, and he's going to sit in Jefferson Davis's desk, and he's going to be known to say, "Thank God I've lived to see this." He's going to walk the streets where freed slaves see Lincoln, realize who he is, and they're going to fall to their knees before him, crying out, right? Lincoln is going to tell them, "Don't kneel to me," right? The only one you should be thankful for and thankful to, right, is God alone, and you should thank Him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter, right? But as sadly as we'll see in Reconstruction, right, so freed slaves would soon discover, right, full liberty was a long time coming for them. All right, so let's talk about Lincoln's assassination and then the aftermath of the war, and then we'll be done. So on the night of April 14th, 1865, or actually it was Good Friday. We just had Good Friday, as you know. Only 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln and Mary Todd are going to attend a play at Ford's Theater, right? And as we know, you probably know the story, right? A half-crazed, fanatically pro-Southern actor, John Wilkes Booth, right, who is a common actor at the theater, so no one really would have suspected anything that night. He is going to slip behind Lincoln as he sat in his box and shoot him in the back of the head. So Lincoln is going to be taken across the street and laid in a house and doctored there. And of course, he's going to lay unconscious throughout the night, but the next morning he's actually going to die. And Secretary Stanton, right, is going to be by Lincoln's side, and he's going to say, "Now he belongs to the ages." And this is kind of one of the famous phrases that we get out of some of the more somber times in American history, right? But Lincoln's going to expire in the arms of victory at really just the pinnacle of his fame, right? He had just won the election and ended the war, and he was taken away. But from the standpoint of his reputation, right, his death probably could have not been better timed if he had hired the assassin. All right, right? So a large number of his countrymen had not suspected of his greatness, and many others had even doubted his ability to be a great president. But his dramatic death helped to erase the memory of his shortcomings and caused his nobler qualities to stand out in a clear relief. So, right, Lincoln's death is going to kind of help people to forget about the things he failed at and his shortcomings, and it's going to bring about people's best memories of Lincoln. And this is something we often do, right, when we lose people, particularly at a young age. We'll forget about the things that they failed at or they weren't good at, or the things that how they let us down, but we remember the good things, right? And Lincoln's reputation is going to be no different, all right? And he's going to be remembered, right, as this genius, right, great president. But the full impact of Lincoln's death was not once apparent to the South. So Lincoln's idea of dealing with the South was to be very gentle with the South, bring them back in, right? And as we will see, especially through the actions of Andrew Johnson, who's going to become president, our country's history is going to take a very different route than probably would have been taken under Lincoln. So let's move on and let's talk about, right, the aftermath of the war, and then we'll be done today. So, right, the Civil War is going to take a grisly toll on the nation. Right, so over 600,000 men are going to die in action or of disease, and in and all, over 1 million are going to be killed or seriously wounded in the war. All right, so it's direct monetary costs of the war are going to total to $15 billion in 1865. So just imagine how much that is today, right? But of course, this figure does not include continuing expenses past the war, right? So things like pensions for soldiers, interest on the national debt, right? The intangible costs like families losing men, right? Women losing husbands, children losing fathers, right? The provider of the family, right? Dislocations, disunities, wasted energies, right? Blasted lives, bitter memories, and burning hates, right? Now, all those things really cannot be calculated in a true amount for what the nation is going to lose during this time period. But the greatest constitutional question, right, of the century is really going to be answered, right? And it's really going to be handed down in blood at Appomattox Courthouse, right? So the extreme states' riders are going to be crushed. The national government, right, tested in the fiery furnace of war, is going to emerge unbroken, even though, all right, we really are broken even after the Civil War. Nullification and secession, right, are going to be laid to rest. But beyond the Civil War, the nightmare of the Republic, right, was the supreme test of American democracy. And we talked about this, and kind of early in the semester, we talked about some of these early challenges, right, to democracy, and whether democracy really could work and whether it would really stand. And of course, the Great Civil War was one of the great tests, if not the greatest test, of whether democracy would endure, right, of whether, in the words of Lincoln in Gettysburg, right, whether a nation dedicated to such principles can long endure. Well, right, the Civil War is going to answer that question that for the time, yes, okay, it could. But today, in 2020, we are still working to answer that question, okay, of whether the United States of America, a nation devoted to such principles, can long endure. Right, so victory for Union. The Union is also going to inspire champions of democracy and liberalism around the world to flourish, right? The Great English Reform Bill of 1867 is going to make Britain a true political democracy. It's going to be passed 2 years after the end of the Civil War. Right, the lost cause, right, of the South was lost, but few Americans today would probably argue that the result was not for the best, that the Union won. Right, the shameful cancer of slavery that existed prior to the completion of the war, right, is going to be sliced away by the sword and by the cannon in the Civil War. Right, and African Americans are going to be at last in a position to claim their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which they were very deserving of. Right, so the nation was again united politically, though many generations still divided spiritually by the passions of the war. Right, even today we still see kind of some of the divisions over right, this bitterness about how the war ended, especially even here in Mississippi. Right, grave dangers were averted by Union victory, right, including the indefinite existence of the institution of slavery, and this kind of aggression of southern states to extend that slavery into new territories and states that were coming about in America. Right, so America still had a long way to go in making the promise of freedom a reality of all its citizens, black and white. But emancipation is going to lay the necessary groundwork, and a united and democratic United States was free to fulfill its destiny as the dominant republic of the hemisphere and eventually of the world. So this is going to free up America. It's going to set the groundwork for freedom for all citizens, not just black and white, but also for women, for other minorities, and today all the more protected classes that we have in American society. And this has kind of been this trend in American history of these great tests throughout the history of our nation of whether or not certain peoples and certain groups and certain classes will be considered as part of the American nation, and whether they will be able to participate and be a part of what makes an American. And the Civil War and its aftermath is really going to set the groundwork, particularly right after the war, for African Americans, and then, like I said, for women and other groups. But especially important that we remember that the effects of the war is going to go on, okay, for 100 years, even more. And in the next chapter, when we talk about Reconstruction, what you're going to see is at the end of the war, okay, you say the war, right, is really not going to be over, okay, socially, economically, and politically, okay, in the time of Reconstruction, we're going to see really this great challenge for the American nation to decide for ourselves, okay, who we would be. And the history is probably not going to be quite like you expected it to be. But once we get to that point, you guys will get another video on that, and we'll continue on with our discussion. So for now, look for the discussion post that I'm posting. Make sure you complete that. Make sure you hope you made it all the way through the video, and then be looking for more work coming soon. All right, guys, have a great afternoon. I appreciate your time. Thanks.